Okay, today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Simona Capisani, who's Assistant Professor of Environmental Philosophy at Durham University. Thanks for joining us today, Simona.
Thanks so much for having me. I am super excited to be here.
Fantastic. Now, I always ask my guests at the start, how did you get started in this line of work, either in climate or sort of environmental philosophy? Where did it begin for you?
Yeah, so kind of interesting. I've been reflecting on this myself that I don't think actually my interests have changed so much from when I was a child. But I have a very interdisciplinary background. So in uni days, for my undergraduate, I did a combination of sort of humanities-based research, but also environmental studies, which was in the American context, both inclusive of science and social science. So that kind of was a background. And then as I continued through graduate school, I actually have my degree in political philosophy by training, but always maintained an interdisciplinary interest. And so as a political philosopher, I like to think about large questions that revolve around questions of fairness and justice. And a lot of my research initially looked at the intersection of questions of migration and shifting geopolitics, but also this sort of shifting changes that impact the state system under climate change. So I think I've always just had an interest in climate and the environment. I was volunteering for river restorations in Los Angeles, where I'm from, when I was a kid. I believe I had a middle school science experiment on the impact of temperature changes on butterflies before I even was taught about climate change. So maybe there was some intuitive interest there. So, but then as my career has been progressing, I tend to do mostly interdisciplinary work that looks at the underlying values that sort of undergird our policy commitments, thinking about how different communities are thinking about different challenges with respect to climate change, but also nature and biodiversity. So I'm increasingly interested actually in the intersections of those two things, and have found that given that these challenges are widespread and very complex, there's no one discipline, right, that owns it. But as a philosopher, I can think about the way that certain assumptions are at play in how people are thinking and discussing to make normative arguments, not just descriptive ones. So what that means is not just thinking about how we're describing the world and the phenomena, but also to think about the big ought questions of what we ought to be doing and how we ought to be acting, that can hopefully help guide or revise our policy and action. So that's a kind of quick history.
So how did you end up at Durham? Because I can't think
Yeah.
of many places that could be more different from Los Angeles than
Yes, I am learning this more and more myself. Yeah, so I'm originally from Southern California and basically just lived up and down the California coast, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego. So I guess the long answer to short answer is the academic job market. So, I had not moved out of California, but then I was very fortunate. I got some postdocs at Harvard and then at Princeton. So I moved eastward across the US much later in my life and my schooling, and then had a few job positions opening, and I applied broadly. And when I got the offer from Durham, not only just in terms of the context and the setting, which is pretty stunning, that was impressive, but I recognized how much the university has sort of interdisciplinary cohort of people working on climate that I thought was, really sort of unique, especially in some contexts, especially in the UK, but also in the US. A lot of disciplines continue to be really siloed, but there seemed to be a lot of encouraging sort of interdisciplinary work happening at Durham. So I took the position. That being said, I am extremely vitamin D deficient and having to learn an entire new ecosystem, which really impacted me. I was just home for a visit and really missed the California wildfires in the Pacific Ocean. I grew up as a surfer, like at
yeah.
Malibu, First Point and stuff. But, there's a coast here. There's some surfing here. There's just way more clouds. So I'm just having to take in sun when it comes.
Yes. Well, if anybody doesn't know the position of Durham City, it's quite stunning, and part of the university is actually inside a castle with a cathedral next door.
Yeah, a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Yes, it is quite a stunning place.
Yep.
Okay, today we're going to talk about just transition. So I thought we'd better start at basic principles.
Mm-hmm.
What is the definition or the accepted definition of a just transition?
Yeah, so you're going to get these annoying answers because I'm a philosopher. So it's good that we're talking about basic principles, but I will say a lot of these things might be contested, and there's actually different force of arguments about what we mean by just transition. So I think there's a sort of like collective or received sense when you hear it being talked about in governance spaces or, in organizations and then also in the academy, but in both academic philosophy, but also in larger questions. I just came from a workshop a couple of weeks ago that was actually debating about how we should understand the concept. So I think just to start with maybe the more I guess, colloquial way of understanding it, it means that, we need to move towards climate policies, climate-friendly policies, and we need to do so in a way that takes into consideration questions of fairness about the implication of those changes for a whole variety of populations. That being said, oftentimes and increasingly, the term just transition, especially in like the sort of UK context and US context increasingly, is meant to sort of refer to a much more narrow set of principles and considerations, often what are lumped into what we understand as industrial policy and net zero commitments. And so oftentimes when you're hearing just transition language from certain cohorts of folks in policy, they really are talking about the energy transition. So they're talking about what it is to be getting energy infrastructure rolled out at scale, renewable energy infrastructure, the kinds of grid building that we need to be doing, shifting in our manufacturing, things like that you would see embodied in the Inflation Reductions Act under the Biden administration. However, that then presents a sort of tension, I think, with what a number of folks, especially in the progressive policy spaces or those of us that are thinking maybe more three-dimensionally, which is the idea that just understanding just transitions or net zero, right, as a set of carbon-centric policy paradigm shifts is really narrowing, or maybe a little bit reductionist, right, because it's just focusing on getting down greenhouse gas emissions. And really, there's a growing concern about those of us that think about the sort of moral or political issues and the sort of political issues that surround this kind of agenda, that we have to think a little bit more around a different kind of paradigm. So that's to think about where inequality sort of intersects with issues around the need to adjust the way that we're living, right, in the context of trying to do better by climate change. So these are inequality issues that have to do with income and wealth inequality, poverty, housing justice issues, even the way that certain kinds of social hierarchies, right, are interfacing with this, thinking about historical injustices, the way certain communities have been impacted through the legacies of climate colonialism, for example, or racial discrimination. And so thinking more expansively about that, there are a whole range of questions that get us to think about if we are shifting towards a more, climate-friendly, carbon-centric, economy and society, is that sufficient, right? So the question of like, is that enough? And often, if we just kind of narrow it in terms of thinking about it in that carbon-centric way, we'll ignore the fact about how we might be repeating certain structures of injustice or inequality in sort of new forms of extractivism that got us to this problem to begin with. And so I think just transitions is an opportunity to actually think a little bit more expansively. And we can talk about in a bit sort of how this was tried to be embodied by like Green New Deal sort of frameworks that have now, I think, shifted even politically to have to be recast in a totally different way. But there was an attempt to kind of move beyond the sort of just industrial policy focus that just transition just gets equated to. So
yeah, I was just thinking, given that it's well understood that the global poor are more at risk from the impacts of climate change than the rich, and that more locally air quality is largely determined by people burning stuff, usually forms of fossil fuels, and even the energy poverty that far too many people live in. sort of a slightly challenging question. Is any transition by definition a just transition?
Yeah, I love this question actually, and I was saying I was just in a workshop a couple weeks ago with folks from a German academic institute that is a just transition, and we basically had some hours of debate over what we mean by just and several hours of what we meant by transition, right? And whether or to what extent any transition is going to be fraught with these sorts of things. So to answer that question, just to take each word separately, justice or just can refer to a whole range of different kinds of dimensions of consideration. So you could be thinking about questions of justice and fairness in the context of decision making or participation, often what we call participatory justice. You might be thinking about just distribution of resources or unjust, for example, exposures to risk, like poor air quality. So that would be a kind of more distributive justice theme. You could think about justice in terms of compensation or restitution. So you might be thinking of a more rehabilitative justice or oftentimes a reparative justice approach. And then you could also think about different ways that cultures are represented or fully integrated, or certain value sets are represented or not in sort of the context in which this change is being developed or these transitions are happening. So it's often easy to then, when we say the word just attaching to transitions, to sort of obscure that we might be talking about a range of different things and different actors might be talking about a range of different considerations. So maybe there's something that we can see as a fair distribution of resources, but not sufficiently fair in terms of who gets to make the decision making about that distribution. So that would be a sort of incompatibility. And now to talk, about the transition side. Well, transition as a term could have a sort of normative valence. You can mean, you're transitioning towards something better, but that's not always the case, right? So if you think about, I mentioned before, new forms of extractivism, if we are to think that the best way to bring air quality down, right, or to improve air quality and to bring emissions down is to move from, fossil fuel burning cars to electric cars, let's say, we also run the risk about thinking about, like, what is the lithium extraction impacts, in the Atacama Desert or on communities where lithium mining is happening, that might actually be exposing folks to a whole new range of injustices and issues, or how that energy inequality that you were talking about, maybe we harvest solar energy in some regions in Africa, but that energy gets offshored. It doesn't actually go back to the communities through which land, maybe capture has or depriving people of access to certain land for other kinds of projects could happen. So it's not always the case that transition is aiming towards something better, right? And therefore, part of what we have to think about is, when we mean our transitions, it's transition towards what, and that's kind of envisioning the sort of being able to diagnose the kinds of inequalities and injustices that have happened that have gotten us to this problem, also to think ahead about new forms of inequalities and injustices that can happen, and then orient our ways towards making sure that we have inclusive and democratic decision making. But you also raise a tension, or maybe another dimension to think about with this, which is that, and it's a type of justice I didn't mention before that I'll mention now, about global justice, that these questions of justice that arise in the context of climate change are happening between states. So globally speaking, the inequalities, where the global south is disproportionately less responsible for climate change and experiencing disproportionately the harms of climate change, versus global north countries that have benefited financially from, fossil fuel extraction and emissions, and who might be seen as needing to bear the burdens and the costs. So you have this kind of differentiated responsibility in the global context. So questions of global justice might ask, what is required? That's one dimension. And then Adam Tooze has suggested, right, we should be thinking about climate inequality as nexus both between the global south and the global north, but also to think about it between economic elites, and so thinking about that kind of inequality even within. So
Yeah.
even within the global north, right, the kinds of climate inequalities sort of cut along, wealth inequality lines and things like this. So you'll have different questions that are arising both within states and then between states as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I suppose one of the thorny topics, because one of the hot topics at the minute is this, the discovery of enslaved labor, basically in the solar panel supply chain in parts of China.
Yep.
But that's being leapt upon by people who haven't shown that much interest in labor rights in, say, the garment industry or the electronics industry, but it's suddenly an issue because it's a solar panel. It's a reason why we shouldn't have net zero in this country. Mm-hmm. So I suppose, how do we, and I personally always believe that sunlight is the
best disinfectant.
Best disinfectant. Yes. Yep. So, but do we use those people's challenge to improve the system, or are we sort of playing slightly into a narrative which is just anti-change?
Yeah, no, I think this is actually exactly why we need to be thinking about inequality and climate change, or just transitions, or net zero, out of just that carbon-centric paradigm, and to think more expansively. So there are, of course, a lot of bad faith actors, global elites, people with particular vested interests in maintaining the status quo and business as usual, who will then suddenly and inconsistently, right, focus on the potential harms or risks of, let's say, renewable energy, infrastructure building, when they suddenly never cared about labor rights to begin with. So one thing is just to address, whether and to what extent, these are bad faith actors. But it's also to look at why we can't think about this transition apart from that intersection of a range of different things. So what do green jobs look like in terms of labor and in terms of addressing labor exploitation? So it wouldn't necessarily be a just transition, right? If we're perpetuating the slave-based conditions of labor, right, or exploitation in labor, even though we're building wind farms or solar panels as opposed to fossil fuel infrastructure. So I think there's a couple of things to address this, right? Of course, many bad actors, right, can sort of capture and whip up sort of resistance campaigns. There's this phenomena that I like using the language of, which I realized was maybe used in American English, but not in British English, which was the idea of astroturfing.
Yep. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was talking to a few people, and people are like, "What are you talking about?" But yeah, so it's this idea of generating sort of false grassroots campaigns in communities to drum up, a sort of antagonism against rolling out of new energy infrastructure, right? And I think there it's important to think about, like, what is the ways that we're combating that messaging, who are the messengers, who are the trusted messengers, but also when we're advocating and organizing around forms of collective action to, advocate for these climate transitions, how can we be stressing the need for democratic reforms, social and economic reforms, right? Things like this that put constraints on the ways that these businesses can be building up. And this is what I think is where when I engage with this sort of thing, when you actually center the justice concerns, so when you center the labor concerns, for example, when you bring in union organizing and labor organizing around sort of green policy infrastructure, many folks I have heard in the scientific community, even, right, policymakers, is that there's one value principle driving considerations. That's cost-benefit analysis. That's one major thing they'll bring up. The second major thing they bring up is time. Yeah. That there's a tension between worrying about all this, like, totally revolutionizing the world and having just labor practices, or dealing with reparations, or repairing the sort of intense damages that have come from colonial exploitation. And like, we have time, like, ticking when it comes to getting climate friendly policies up to scale. And so often folks, you hear, even good faith, folks that are working towards improvement, so not these bad faith folks trying to disrupt, are saying, well, if you're focusing on political strategies that are bringing in all these other considerations, we're not going to be able to do this at scale, and we're not going to be able to do this quickly enough. And so oftentimes even within, so setting aside the bad faith actors that are using delay or disinformation or picking up on these sorts of things, but for perverse ends, you also have good faith actors that are saying, well, hold on, like this looks like too much of a lift to do, and we just simply need to do the transition, then we'll worry about the justice questions later. And increasingly, there's empirical evidence that's coming out by social scientists about how actually centering socioeconomic inequalities and labor issues makes climate policies better, more sticky, more long lasting. And so if you're thinking about actually moving in an efficient way, that's one thing to consider. And then there's also the conversations to say, like, going back to those considerations of morality, that if you're simply putting folks in worse economic insecurity or in conditions of exploitation, that that itself, right, is not good policy. So there's like pragmatic ways to think about, and I think efficiency ways to think about why we should be addressing these sorts of issues. I will mention too, strategy wise, in terms of communication, you'll see a lot of folks increasingly, and this is in the US context, actually start to center and focus on, let's say, the labor issues or the housing inequality issues and lead with those first as climate policy. One, because they are more salient in terms of politically speaking, again, in the US context, rather than centering climate, unfortunately, right? But also to start to educate people about like how these things are deeply intersecting and deeply interconnected, and to pull from people's experiences so far that they are. And so yeah, I mean, I think about also like conflict, right, with like labor unions and stuff. Like police unions are a very strong organizing, faction that work towards legitimizing continued harm, right? In that context, ditto with, of course, organizing around dirty energy infrastructure. But they are making the point that you simply just can't leave entire populations of people disenfranchised and exploited as you continue on in the transition. So that's the way to kind of bring these things into, I think, a way of educating and messaging, is that we can't segregate out these considerations.
Yeah, and I suppose you're kind of sat right bang in the middle of that, because I was bigging up the beauty of the city of Durham, but of course you're surrounded by the former Durham coalfields, and many of the villages outside Durham city are some of the most deprived parts of the UK. And that transition away from extracting coal in the UK has certainly left a large employment gap. But there's that sort of takes me on to this thing, and you mentioned about unionization, is that because fossil fuel industries have been about for a couple of hundred years, they tend to be much more heavily unionized than the green energy emerging technology. So there is very definitely a sort of voice of organized labor, because that's their role, is to protect the jobs in their sector, saying where are the jobs for our members. And the way the transition is going, which is very much electric, is stymieing. And again, another hot topic in this country is the Grangemouth refinery, where people were promised jobs in green hydrogen or carbon capture and storage. And those technologies are not taking off, and the world is literally going electric. So it seems a bit of an imbalance, particularly, we have a Labour government where that grew out of the Labour Party, grew out of the Labour movement and unions, and still has very close relationships, where there seems to be quite a lot of friction there in how the transition proceeds.
Yep. Yes. So, and, just to mention about seeing it on our doorstep, right? Like, I've engaged with a lot of former miners in the villages around Durham on a few different projects, and also working with local farmers where there is a similar issue around, better climate and biodiversity farming, but the sort of economic impacts of these practices. And I think there's a few things to touch on with what you're saying. And we can start from the sort of top with Labour Party politics and things like that, where much of this sort of maybe more centrist inclined labor policy, like the party, right, rolling out, over the course of since the election, seems to be backing away from pursuing a lot of the more, aggressive climate and important climate commitments that it was promising, but also moving towards a kind of de-risking economic scheme where the priorities about, any kinds of sets of transitions or addressing major needs, let's talk about like housing, for example, here in the UK, they're more oriented towards de-risking markets for BlackRock or turning to BlackRock, right, to solve the kinds of housing problems rather than thinking about state capacity, rather than thinking about actual investments and expanding the social safety net in different kinds of ways. And that's a distinct sort of neoliberal approach to these questions, in which I do think then many populations, particularly like those in the Northeast, can make a claim to say that they're not being centered and considered, by a party that otherwise makes claims to be there for the working people, right? And we've seen this kind of aggravation extend all the way into the politics that we see in the US. So I'm constantly here being like, please learn the lessons of the failures of the Democratic Party in the US here. So I'm not living in that hellscape now, having moved here. But this is the idea that thinking about what it is to meaningfully promise good paying, unionized supporting jobs. Now, the promise of employing folks through technologies that we don't even necessarily have fully developed or at scale, like any kind of drawdown, carbon capture and storage, CCS, or even other kinds of forms of geoengineering mechanisms, are in ways like mechanisms to actually keep business as usual going to some extent, right?
Absolutely.
So there's like that's a set of priorities that also might be failing on mitigation priorities as well. So you're failing folks in terms of looking at transition and employment, and you're also promising pathways to net zero that are relatively spurious, or that I have some doubts about, that can allow certain kinds of practices to continue. There's been really interesting methods of like retraining programs and jobs programs that have been successful, like I've seen in the US context, which is, for example, taking folks that were working on oil rigs in Texas that like engage with similar kinds of risk and skill sets, and then having them work on wind farms, right? That sort of a thing. But also, and this is something that I care about a lot in the context of my research, engaging with communities themselves and allowing and having communities have a voice and some sort of bottom-up feeding in about what these transitions look like. Because if you are going to come in and then impose sets of changes without any kind of democratic participation or integration of people's views, you have growing resentment, you don't have buy-in. So oftentimes some of the most like renewable energy moves and transitions in terms of jobs and impacts on communities, if you look at the research, tends to be when the messengers about those new projects rolling out come from neighboring communities that also had successes, where the communities can also identify the co-benefits of that industry taking up in those areas, can set the agendas about how profits can flow back into communities, not just through wages, but also through building infrastructure or schools or that sort of a thing. And so I think it would be best, right, if companies that are seeing themselves as part of the transition, right, also understand the importance of integrating, not just through mere consultation processes, but actually having communities be able to identify this sort of thing. Because oftentimes when you're talking to folks, and this happens when I'm out in the communities talking to folks as well, is that when you kind of pull out the political buzzwords or the kinds of things that have been captured by sort of political messaging, and you ask people if they want healthy air and water, or if you talk to people about their major concerns are about having enough, being able to provide food for their children, right? Or being able to see themselves as participants in their own societies. And oftentimes these folks then get cast out as climate deniers or bad actors. But, if you think about the conditions that have led for them being sort of cut out on the decision-making processes, right? With the smashing of the unions up here in the Northeast under Thatcher, right? And these ideas that Thatcher gave of there's no such thing as society. You create these elements of isolation disenfranchisement and disconnection that then can lead to these kinds of forms of resistance. So I think people are like rightfully upset if they're promised certain kinds of things that are not delivered. So that's why it's really important that policymaking is both integrating people in the processes of figuring out what that looks like, and also is investing meaningfully in the kinds of jobs that we need that will impact people's lives. And I have big question marks around whether carbon capture and storage is the place to be, or geoengineering is the place to be shoving all our economic resources, right? As opposed to building sustainable housing, addressing soil health, and dealing with basic mitigation that we know is what we need to do, right, to get to 1.5. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've spent at least 25 years being told that carbon capture and storage and hydrogen are the next big thing. And they just have failed to deliver. Whereas as we speak, it's expected today that the grid might hit zero carbon, the UK electricity grid, for the first time, using solar and wind. But
Yep.
Yeah.
We know that the problem, right, that I tend to try to explain to people is like, we know what works. And this is not to be anti-science or anti-innovation, right? But I have listened in on, lobbying sessions at the White House for certain kinds of geoengineering interventions and certain carbon capture and storage interventions. And, there's a lot of technology profiteering, things to be made there that I think also looks shiny and fancy for governments to invest in, but like I said, also, allows for certain kinds of business as usual models because we think, oh, well, we'll just continue to emit and suck it out, as opposed to actually figuring out how to store renewable energy, right?
Yeah.
Get the grid to a reliable place and spending our money and our energy and our job development there. I think in the US, someone was crunching the numbers, so I won't be able to quote it exactly, but like the need for training electricians is massive. It could be like a huge, wartime effort scaling up, right, of jobs and training that could be good paying unionized jobs that we actually, need.
Yeah.
Things like that that are not rocket science.
Yeah. And I realized while we were speaking there that on that the sort of biggest version of the just transition is the various climate finance mechanisms agreed at COP meetings.
Yeah.
And I'm almost surprised that they survive, because particularly in this day of culture wars and misinformation and et cetera, it's quite a hard sell to people to say, well, we've been burning all this coal for a couple of 100 years, and the temperature rises are historically we've got a huge contribution to that, so we should be paying somebody in a foreign part to put in flood defenses or whatever that might be, or help their transition to a low carbon thing. And it's I suppose it's a similar debate in a way to slavery reparations. It's can be quite a hard sell, particularly if people are deliberately stirring the waters up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So so that was a bit of an observation of mine.
Yeah, no, I mean, and this is something I write about this as well, about how we actually have to think about the sort of global obligations that we have within the context of the territorial state system in a different way, right? And so oftentimes these kinds of schemas are either seen as, right, like charity mechanisms that can then be pulled back at any time, or are, again, pushed back on and saying, well, we have the problems at home. And so you have these like increasing nationalist turns. And this is not just even from the right. If you look at the way that the Biden administration was doing a lot of its framing, a lot of it was like nationalist-based economic policy rather than thinking about aid. So currently right now, in the sort of global governance frameworks of the UNFCCC, you have a sort of really impoverished green climate fund that there's not a lot of teeth pressing countries to have to put money in. In fact, there's a lot of double counting when it comes to countries talking about the contributions that they're making. And there is like increasing pushback around, although there was an innovation to talk about loss and damage. But most countries like the US, for example, don't want to admit of loss and damage based responsibilities or any kind of backwards looking responsibilities or forward looking responsibilities countries for adaptation, because if they're on the hook for that, they're on the hook for a lot of other things. And I think that there has been several different kinds of arguments around climate financing that can maybe try to move around the co-opting of these kinds of pernicious, sort of increasingly nationalist arguments, and also to think more expansively about what can fit within financing initiatives. So you and your listeners may or may not have heard of things like the Bridgetown Initiative, which was a call for sort of urgent action about thinking about completely reformulating the international financial architecture. And this was brought forward by Mia Mottley of Barbados. And this was talking about all sorts of different ways to think about financing, especially, for global South priorities around adaptation or mitigation issues. And that could be thinking about finances through things like debt restructuring, right? So instead of holding certain, let's say, global South nations accountable to paying back debt to global North, what would like debt forgiveness to then go into adaptation investment look like? So this could help also developing countries basically sustainably manage their debt obligations in ways, especially if those countries are under heavy-duty debt burdens, right? So things like that, or mobilizing, a range of things. So this is not just on a state base. The Bridgetown Initiative also talked about mobilizing private sector investment, which includes like encouraging private sector, investment in development projects that are specifically related to sustainable development or climate action. And then the Bridgetown Initiative was also pushing on transforming certain governance of international financial institutions. So that would be more responsive to the needs of developing countries, and also even pushing for different kinds of forms of international trade that would be more equitable. And so these are just examples where, the government of Barbados was leading on this and created this initiative to help to understand why the international finance architecture is itself outdated and not fit for purpose under conditions of climate change, and try to talk about the need for UN member states to raise basically $100 billion a year to help pay for climate related loss and damage, right, that's suffered mostly by the global South. So there's things like this that are talking about different ways instead of just seeing it as countries dumping financing, into certain things. Then there's like the communication, I think, within countries for those of us that are climate communicators. So for example, if you bring up like how much is invested in military spending, right? Or how much is invested in other kinds of sectors where people's like tax money is going to that they don't seem to have much democratic say over, you might be able to show proportionately, how some of this financing is structured. But then you have all the way from, different kinds of arguments to even talking about global wealth taxes, like Piketty, has argued for, which might be harder to advance given the current political climate. But I believe some of the experiments are being rolled out just recently, right, in France on this. So I think we have to think creatively, and we also have to be thinking about how to communicate these sorts of things that then contest the way that people just think it's resources being offshored elsewhere, which is tough, right, in this political climate. But I don't think hyper nationalist focuses, even from centrist or like left leaning parties, is necessarily the way to go. I mean, I understand there's increased protectionism, and that might play well, but it's if you think about some of the constraints that were put in by the Inflation Reductions Act, it actually like slows the capacity for development, right, towards some of these if we're having to like build the entire manufacturing infrastructure in the US, which is like likely not going to happen. I mean, maybe, if you maybe with chips and things like this, it might eventually. But I know, for example, we were trying to, in the US, build some offshore wind farms on the East Coast, but we don't have the barges because most of the barges and the technology comes from the Netherlands. And then because of constraints in the IRA, like we couldn't use that infrastructure, right? So within reason, the protectionism.
Yes, and then the White House arbitrarily removed the permits for one of them.
Exactly.
I sent us off on down an
Yeah,
international rabbit hole there, which was very
yeah,
interesting and fascinating. But I suppose we should bring it back to our audience,
yeah.
who are predominantly, as I understand it, people who are delivering sustainability or net zero strategies within their own organization.
Hmm.
How would they be best looking at integrating just transition principles into their organizational plan?
Yeah, so I think a few of the things we've touched on maybe could be heuristics or guiding principles. So one is to ask, regardless of, what you're working on, um, whether and to what extent you have sort of meaningful engagement with the communities that you might be intersecting with, or how you're looking at the power inequalities that arise between the different stakeholders that you're engaging with, and looking at whether the mechanisms or the infrastructure that you have in making decisions or in thinking about design of solutions, right, is sufficiently democratic. I think that's something to think about. Or, obviously within the constraints of how you're working, to think about how that could be more expansive. And you think sort of more, what I mean more expansively, think about all the range of different ways that inequality can even manifest within the context of your organization, but then also the things that you're working on. So I think that's important. I think it would be important to have conversations in your organization actually about what you mean by just transition as a way to sort of map the values and priorities, and to make sure that you have critical discussions about that. So when you're talking about just transition, are you merely just talking about sort of industrial policy? Do you have a sort of larger sense of what elements of justice you're considering? Like I enumerated some of those earlier. And then also thinking about the way that certain framings that you're using, like net zero, are productive, but also potentially close off sets of options or priorities. So I think there's a lot, at least, as a philosopher that I bring to this space, is encouraging people to understand that you are building assumptions in, whether you're conscious of it or not, right, into the ways that you're understanding certain things, the priorities that you're setting, and the mechanisms by which you make decisions. And so if you can have meaningful checkpoints or conversations about, yes, like whose values are being prioritized? What do we mean by this? What assumptions are being built into X, Y, or Z? That might seem inefficient at first, right? Because it takes time to actually try to reconcile maybe different views and be able to have different critical discussions about that. But ultimately, you can then be more transparent to your own organization and the people that you're working with about what those things are. I think phrases like net zero or 1.5, were heuristics to use, but they can also take on a life of their own. So to give an example, right, like 1.5, and now we're in conditions of overshoot. That doesn't mean jettison, right, striving towards getting as close as we can to bringing it down. But sometimes the very idea or the framing of 1.5 might then instill in people that there's changes or shifts in effort or things that should happen. Similarly, with net zero, what is the idea of net zero instead of like actual zero? Allow you to continue in terms of business as usual versus not. So being somewhat critical about how those frameworks are working within your organization. So be attentive to sort of the underlying assumptions that are at play. Really look at the sort of democratic structures, or whether you're doing both bottom up and top down sort of decision making, especially with different communities, thinking about how power and inequality moves through the systems that you're working with, including your own organization. Those are at least a starting point. And then to maybe address some of the biases that might be at play, like all of us knowing that this is an emergency and urgent action, but thinking about how, I guess, an overemphasis on speed and getting to scale might jettison
Mm-hmm.
questions of justice, and seeing how you can kind of reconcile those two things, even they might be seemingly irreconcilable. So there's an excellent paper by the Indigenous environmental philosopher Kyle Powys-White, which he talks about commitments to basically climate tipping points versus relational tipping points. And if you're trying to repair sets of injustices and relationships, or how your, institution might intersect with those actually are very slow and long and take a lot of like trust rebuilding that needs to happen. That doesn't seem to square with the quick, rapid time frame that we need to move towards climate. And he doesn't necessarily give a solution at the end of that paper, so it's a little like demoralizing, because it's like, well, what do we do? But I think part of like admitting that some of these things may not be able to be reconciled, but that doesn't mean to drop off the justice parts of the consideration. And also to then look at some of the empirical literature, say when you are focusing on inequalities, you might actually be getting better or more effective designed programs, policies, and better and more effective implementation. So checking biases like that, or values like that, to evaluate them constantly about whether they're serving those goals, or what goals they end up sort of gearing you towards, might be helpful.
Yeah. And I suppose, as well as, within the factory fence or the office walls, there's the whole value chain, supply chain side of things as well, which I suppose goes international again, when we were talking about lithium extraction or production of solar panels,
different scales,
and that transparency that's required. Are there are there good resources for this kind of thing when people might be worried about where injustices might be in the supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, I think well, I'll speak to, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but there's an Australian nonprofit that's training companies and matching companies with social scientists, for example, or maybe philosophers even, right, about having the kind of expertise on how to engage. So this is particularly a nonprofit that's working with private companies that are doing renewable energy transition projects with communities. And part of the trainings that they're doing, which I think is a really interesting model, is training people to like actually engage and work with different populations within the supply chain. Right, around this sort of thing. And it's very easy for, I guess, an institution to think about maybe one end of the supply chain as opposed to another. So I'm, engaging in a research project right now on soil health, and there's a consideration about certain kinds of mechanisms to add amendments to the soil, right? And there's a concern about what the sort of end of the supply chain, consumers buying food that integrate those amendments, would have. And, I was raising some questions with colleagues about, well, what about actually engaging with farmers and the land managers from the onset, right, in the beginning of that? So there's often like left behind, or not even left behind, but somewhat deprioritized stakeholders, even within supply chains. So thinking about what it would be like if the concern is stretching across those sorts of things. But yeah, I mean, the answer is not like I necessarily like go hire academics on it. That's not what I'm saying. But to actually look at ways that you could train up, or that it is a set of skills, right, with expertise to be thinking about some of these questions, and to find out whether there needs to be specific roles within the organization that are focusing on this in particular, and then doing the due diligence as best as you can with transparency to look for places of inequality and exploitation within the supply chain that you're working with. I know there's a lot of greenwashing and sort of, it's hard to figure out labor practices, especially on the sort of international structure. But that's something, right, that there is to take responsibility about. If I can remember the name of that nonprofit, I'll send it. You can attach it in the show notes. Yeah, but that's like an example of a model, right, that might be interesting for folks, or at least that I found pretty compelling, which is also showing that companies have like an investment in doing
and
that sort of work.
Engaging with NGOs in general.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. And also just being careful about who it is that you mean that you're engaging with when you're engaging in the community, right? So not, again, coming in and assuming that the person you're engaging with is the spokesperson for. There's a lot of like meaningful work that has to be done to build trust if you are going into particular communities. And being able to be careful about the kinds of power dynamics, social dynamics, relationships that are happening in those contexts as well, if people are doing that kind of on the ground work. So, but yeah, so again, thinking about how these perceptions that we're bringing into things and these underlying values and assumptions can characterize what we're doing. So allow them to be subject to scrutiny.
Yeah, absolutely. Goes back to to sunlight being the best disinfectant, if I can spit it out this time.
Yeah.
I got it halfway out last time.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, that's absolutely fantastic. I've taken up a great deal of your time. Thank you for all the expertise and insights. I think that was a fascinating discussion. It's given me a lot of food for thought. My brain's spinning here slightly, but
well, thanks so much for having me on. I mean, it's good to be able to have these cross conversations, and and just to be actually like speaking to you and folks that are doing the work on the ground, and so yeah, I very much valued the conversation.
Is there a textbook? A sort of non-technical textbook in this field, or?
That's a good question. There's several pieces on climate justice if you want to get it from philosophers, and I can send those along and we can put them in the show notes. But I think increasingly there are folks doing really good work in public writing and messaging on this. So I'll mention there's the Climate and Community they just changed the name, Climate and Community Institute, or is it initial? Let's see. Climate and Community Institute. And that's basically a progressive and climate and economy think tank based in the States. And they work with progressive policymakers to be sort of improving implementation, but also shifting narratives, addressing these kinds of coalitions that need to be built. And they have a number of academics as well as, community organizers, and they provide a lot of briefs and research that's really accessible on a range of things. So even though that's a U.S. context, I think a lot of the messaging might be helpful. So that's just something coming off the top of my mind. I think they do really excellent work, and thinking about sort of transformations holistically, both climate and biodiversity. And looking at the researchers that are involved there, they basically talk about like transportation, mining, care, education, housing, the energy and industrial stuff, as well as global systems and policy and water and land use. So they try to cover the gamut.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for that. So I was winding up, and then I said another ball rolling.
Well, you're also saying that to a philosopher and an American and a Californian who has the gift of gab. So,
well, we fully appreciate it, because you really have enlightened me, and I hope our listeners as well. So thank you very much, Simona.
Yeah, thank you.